As you see, the topic is Timbuktu and the first emancipation of the early 19th century. I like that first emancipation phrase. I actually learned it relatively recently because we always have a sense that the beginning of emancipation for Black people was after the Civil War, and all northern states had passed laws to end slavery by 1804, New Jersey being the last one of those. So now my screen is frozen and my slides are not moving. Page down. Okay, our points of discussion. I guess I'll use the pointer. When were emancipation laws first passed in the northern states? What did antebellum freedom look like? What types of documentation are available for antebellum free Black communities that are frequently dismissed as being non-existent for Black people before 1870? How the history of Timbuktu fits into this discussion, and what is my personal stake in this history? I always tell the story of my cousin Lillian. She was a favorite cousin. She was actually my grandmother's first cousin, so she was much older than I was. She was like the cool adult that we used to be able to talk to, more like a peer, and she was somebody I really liked. And so she was the one that first told me and my siblings about Timbuktu, and she happened to be the person who was the keeper of our family property. When I say keeper, one day my mother and I went to her house to receive the documents for the property. We expected contemporary deeds and typewritten documents. We got about 24 pages of documents that looked like this. So this was the deed for when my fourth great grandfather purchased a parcel in Timbuctoo in 1829 for $30. The deed is on the left. There are 3 or 4 pages of that. The center is a crude survey, and then that's the cover page. But I was just, I don't know, I can't even begin to say how I was impressed by knowing this was in my family. Not only do we get the deed for the purchase, we got my fourth great grandfather's will, which had a lot of names and interesting information about the family in it. We got, by having his will, I was able to go to the county surrogate's office and get the inventory of his estate. So I know how many cows and pigs he had. I know the furniture in his house, the clothes that he owned, and that he had an estate worth $108. Not a lot of money, but nevertheless, a lot for the time for a Black person. And then the funniest of the documents was an indenture of mortgage. After my fourth great grandfather died in 1843, his wife, daughter, and son-in-law went to take out a mortgage for $155. They paid it back in installments of a few dollars a year. The receipts are all written on the back of this indenture of mortgage. And the funny one was the entry for 1875 and 1876. It says received of John Giles, who was my great-great-grandfather's brother, 2,000 bricks at $12 a thousand to pay the interest on the within bond for 1875 and 1876. I envisioned, of course, that John Giles drove up to the place where the mortgagor lived. His name was William Hilliard. I don't remember if I mentioned that or not, but that's an important name for later. Anyway, I envisioned him driving up with a wagon load of bricks. It turns out that my great-great-grandfather and his brothers worked in a brickyard that was owned by Mr. Hilliard, and they didn't have any money to pay the mortgage that year, so they had to make 2,000 bricks. And when they made the 2,000 bricks, that was the way they satisfied the debt. And so that gives me an image of my ancestors in terms of the work they did and the creative things they had to do to get along. But I was just shocked to know that I had so many antebellum family records. I was really, really surprised because there's a quote by Henry Louis Gates that essentially says that if you're Black and you want to find out about your family before 1870, you have to look in records of slavery. And we think, in fact, that the Emancipation Proclamation, which we're all familiar with, was the beginning of the end of slavery in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation was actually directed only to states in rebellion, the states that had seceded from the Union. It did not affect or apply to the northern states because they had never seceded from the Union in the first place. It did not apply to Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, which were not in rebellion. These were the border states that were slave states, but never seceded from the Union. And it did not apply to the District of Columbia that fell under federal jurisdiction. So here is a picture of the first emancipation. I have indicated at the top that it was between 1777 and the early 1800s. In 1777, Vermont outlawed slavery in its constitution. Next, Pennsylvania in 1780, and then Massachusetts in 1783. And by 1804, all the states that were part of the original colonies had passed some legislation to end slavery. And then the ones off to the left were territories that had not joined the Union yet. And then another thing you see in this map besides the dates are the colors. The darkest colors have the largest proportion of free Black people, and the lightest colors, of course, have the smallest proportion of free Black people. No surprise because of the geography. On the one hand, we know that there were free Black people because we know we had institutions. We know that Mother Bethel AME Church was founded in Philadelphia in 1794, that Abyssinian Baptist Church was founded in New York City in 1808. There had to be some significant number of free Black people in order to found institutions. So on the one hand, we know free Black people exist, but on the other hand, we don't seem to appreciate the extent to which we did exist. If you look at the specific numbers from the US Census, you see that between 1800 and 1860, between 11 and 14% of Black people in the United States were free in each one of those years. That's a significant chunk of people. People talk about how the majority of free Black people lived in the South, which is true, but the majority of the Black population, like approaching 90% of the whole Black population in the South. Of course, 53% of free Black people lived in the South and only 47% in the North. But we have to look at that a little further, and we're coming to the end of these statistical slides, just so you know, because everyone doesn't like numbers as much as I do. But if you look in the year 1830, it's true that the number of Black people who were free was bigger in the South than it was in the North. But within those regions, within the South, only 8% of Black people who lived in the South were free. In 1830, already 97% were free. And so think of what it was like to live in a society where you could build institutions, where you could build schools, where there was some degree of self-determination. Certainly there was fear of being captured and taken back to slavery. Certainly there was discrimination, but there also was a vibrant community of free Black people, which was the majority in the society. So on the one hand, if you look at the pie, the slice of the pie that was free Black people in the South was bigger than in the North, but within those slices, the vast majority of Black people were free in the North as early as 1830. In New Jersey, as I said, gradual manumission began in 1804. It wasn't really instant manumission because people born after July 4th, 1804 had to serve as indentured servants to the masters of their mothers. But over time, there was a large community of free Black people. It wasn't always the way it was supposed to be because, for example, there were stories of people being sold into slavery when they should have been free. But again, you have to balance the fact, yes, there were people that were sold back into slavery, but yes, there were people that owned property and established their own communities. Coming toward the end of the statistics here, if you look at New Jersey in the year 1820, and you look at the counties with the darkest colors, the dark colors signify large proportions of free Black people, upwards of 90%, whereas in the northern counties, there were still a substantial number of Black people that were enslaved. Why would it be that the southern counties were so different than the northern counties? This is one of those times when I would interact and look at somebody and people would raise their hands, and I can't do that because I can't see you. But to make a long story short, the influence of Quaker people in the southern counties had such a great impact that as early as 1790, the first census 2/3 of Black people in Southern New Jersey were free. Only 11% of Black people in the northern counties were free. And again, that's predominantly because of the influence of Quakers. We're familiar with the fact that Quakers were advocates to end slavery, and that they were active in the Underground Railroad, and that there was a large contribution from Quakers to the manumission process. We also recognize that everything wasn't always as bright as we would like it to be, but the long and the short of it is that Quakers had a large influence in the end of slavery. And while there were a lot of church groups that had this same impact, the difference with Quakers was that they were able to get their leadership to declare that slavery was no longer permitted among their membership, and if people continue to hold slaves, they can no longer be part of the Society of Friends. There was also, though, the presence of German and Dutch people in the northern counties, and the Dutch had a system whereby you got so many acres of land depending on how many enslaved people you had, and so that resulted in more people being enslaved in the northern counties. Finally, we have the map of antebellum free Black communities. In 1860, there were like 24, 25 settlements of free Black people in the state. You can see most of them are in the South. I don't know what happened to the word Timbuctoo. Timbuctoo is actually number 18. I guess that happened when the slide got applied, when this graphic got applied to the slide. But there were many free antebellum free Black communities. In all of those communities, and many of them, there were churches, there were schools, there were Black people that owned property, going all the way back 4 or 5 decades before the Civil War. With that background, we get to the important part, which is Timbuctoo, settled beginning in 1826 by formerly enslaved and free Black people with the assistance of Quakers. It was one of several such communities. It was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and in Timbuctoo, residents, Black people owned land, established schools and churches, and sometimes even read about themselves in the local paper. This is a map of Timbuctoo, or a map of Burlington County from 1849. If you're familiar with the area, I know we had many Burlington County residents in the chat. This Burlington and Mount Holly Railroad was actually Route 541 from Burlington to Mount Holly. So I learned from this map that there used to be a train that took you from Burlington City to Mount Holly. And this was back in 1849. This is Willingboro down here. It was called Willingboro, spelled with an H. That H is from Willingboro. This is Rancocas. And this is what we today call Beverly Rancocas Road, or Mount Holly Rancocas Road. And Timbuctoo is right here, right before you get to Mount Holly. This was actually called the Mount Holly Turnpike, because it was an important road of the day. And then this just tells you where Timbuctoo is located. I point out, someone said Timbuctoo in the past because maybe 13 years ago, there were some researchers. A researcher had a quote in the paper that Timbuctoo didn't exist anymore. And for some reason, we have a hard time getting rid of that myth. We say Timbuctoo is an unincorporated community in West Hampton Township, Burlington County, according to the U.S. Geological Survey Geographic Names Information System. That's why it's on the map, and it never stopped being on the map. So Timbuctoo never did cease to exist, contrary to popular opinion. Who are the first inhabitants of Timbuctoo? We know that David Parker, Ezekiel Parker, Wardell Parker, and Hezekiah Hall paid between $8.33 and $24.05 for parcels of land. We know they bought them from a man named William Hilliard, who was the same man who gave my family a mortgage in 1842 or 3. It was actually his son. It was not William Hilliard himself. The fifth recorded sale was in 1829, when a man named John Brewer purchased 1 acre of land from a Quaker farmer named Samuel Atkinson. That was the important one because John was my 4th great grandfather. One thing I never cease to be amazed about all of the documents that exist in our government offices. If you go to the office of the Burlington County Clerk, you can find deeds back to the late 1700s. We have the COVID pandemic to thank for the fact that most of those documents are now available online. So that if you know the name of your ancestor and where they lived, you could actually, this map was assembled before those documents were online. We had to search them by microfilm. Someone else did that, I didn't. But all of this information is searchable online. So we know, for example, this is the Mount Holly Turnpike, which was Rancocas Road. My family, my ancestor bought lot 4 and lot 5. We also now own lot 3. This is lot 2 is where the school was. Lot 15 is where the cemetery was and still is today. And a lot of these lot lines, not a lot, but there's some of these lots that still have the same boundaries that they did 150 years ago. So we know these are all the original settlers from Timbuctoo. We know that here where the cemetery was is where the Zion Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal African Church was. The church is gone, the cemetery is still there. These are the people I think about when I think about Timbuctoo. The one woman in the middle is my great-grandmother. These are all people that grew up in Timbuctoo. These are grandchildren and great-grandchildren of my 4th great-grandfather. And all but one of these people lived in my lifetime, and they used to tell stories about the rural area that they grew up in New Jersey, but I never in a million years thought that it went back to 1829. I thought it was new from the era that they grew up in. Where do these people get the news? They got their news from the New Jersey Mirror and the Mount Holly Herald, which were the local papers, also the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Courier Post, and several other papers. But one thing that's good about newspapers.com, for those of you that are familiar with it, is you can go to newspapers.com and search Timbuctoo and New Jersey or Pennsylvania with particular dates and get mentions of Timbuctoo from the newspaper. We're only going to look at a couple of articles today from the New Jersey Mirror, but the first one, let me talk about the New Jersey Mirror first. It's actually indexed, partially indexed, so you can go to the Burlington County Library website and search Timbuctoo and find information about Timbuctoo. And so you get to read about Timbuctoo from the perspective of people who lived there in the 1800s. There were interesting stories. This is a very positive story. There's a really interesting story about a failed attempt to capture a formerly enslaved man by the name of Perry Simmons in 1860. The story used words like invaders and kidnappers to talk about the slave catchers. And when Perry died, they said he is finally beyond the reach of his Southern master. Very clearly, this story was against slavery. On the other hand, there were stories that were insulting to Black people. There was one called Trouble Among the Darkies. That was the headline. That talked about a conflict in Timbuctoo, and they said things like the woolly-headed people to make fun of our hair. So it's really a mixed bag. On the one hand, very clearly, the story about the failed attempt to capture Perry Simmons is interesting. It's also inspiring. It's nice to know that there were people in the mainstream that were supportive of manumission and denouncing people that came to capture people and take them into slavery, whether they had been slaves before or not. But then we have these other stories that are pejorative. I wanted to look at 3 obituaries. This one is about Hezekiah Hall. And I can't read the top because the controls are in the way, but I know that it says something to the effect of last Friday on February 24th, 1851, Hezekiah Hall, colored, aged about 60 years. Early in life, he was a slave and belonged to Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Charles Carroll was the signer of the Declaration of Independence and also the first elected senator from Maryland. So this particular Hezekiah Hall is somebody who escaped from a famous person in Maryland. It was a very positive obituary. It said that he was regarded by everyone as a man of unblemished character, and his truly upright walk and Christian deportment commanded the highest respect. He was one of the first settlers that bought one of the first 4 parcels of land. He was a community leader that we saw in incorporation documents, and he married my 4th great-grandmother when my 4th great-grandfather died. So he's actually an ancestor. And so this is the oldest obituary I have for my family from 1851. Then we have Lambert Guile that said, Lambert Giles, I want to see if I can move. Oh, I can move it. Let's move it down here. Lambert Giles, a well-known colored man, long a resident of this vicinity, was found dead by the side of the road from Mount Holly to Rancocas near the barn of the late Caleb A. Woodward on Monday evening at about 7:30. It goes on to say that he was at work. He was walking home. He probably had an epileptic seizure. And then at the end it says, Lambert was an industrious and worthy man and noted for his courtesy of manner. He's about 60 years of age. And he was my third great grandfather. So he is somebody that I've been looking all over Ancestry. What was before, this was before Ancestry.com was online where records were easily available. I didn't know what his name was, so I couldn't find him. It turns out that all I had to do was go to the Berlin County Library online and look in their index and put the name Giles, which I know to be my family name. Then the next week it said, the sudden demise of the old colored whitewasher Lambert Giles last week put a number of housekeepers on the wing to find someone to fill his engagements. Lambert followed a humble calling, but was regarded as about perfect in his art and will be more missed than would be many of our more pretentious citizens. He was often engaged weeks in advance. So now I have a story about my ancestor. He was not a famous person. He was not a particularly learned person. He was a laborer, but he was somebody that people liked. I also have his gravestone. It says he was born in 1875 and died in, born in 1815 and died in 1875. These are treasures to me. You can imagine most people, if you have written information about your family members, it's probably something that your family kept, but to find it in the newspaper and to really find this information online and the gravestone to be able to go where it is, that was just very special to us. Last one is about David Parker. And it says that he was an age-colored man for perhaps 1/2 century, occupied a prominent position within his race in this vicinity, and commanded the respect and esteem of a large number of white friends. Describing like that, it goes on to say that he died at a residence in Timbuctoo on Sunday, aged 75 years. He was called King David, and I wonder why he was called King David. There have been many articles that I've seen that call him King David. He was like the non-elected community leader, but it said that he was possessed of more than ordinary intelligence, determined will, made him a natural leader among his people as long as his physical strength lasted, and he was generally at the head of any movement among them being Black people. He was one of the first settlers in 1826. He's very prominent. His name is in a dozen or more land transactions. He was the president of the trustee board of the church. He founded an organization called the United Sons and Daughters of Timbuctoo and Vicinity, which was a self-help organization. He was like the man for as long as he was younger. But in 1877, he was like 77 years old. And by the time he got older, he was not as influential. But again, these are details about Timbuctoo that who knew we could find them. This is the Battle of Pine Swamp as we move towards the end of the newspaper stories. It tells you about a well-known slave catcher named George Alberti who comes looking for someone named Perry Simmons. He comes with a posse looking for Perry Simmons. Perry had lived in the area for a decade or more and had a strong network of friends. But when news of the attempt to capture Simmons reached his allies, a large group rushed to Simmons' aid, yelling and screaming, wielding weapons, and scaring the smaller raiding party off. Now, why do I know that? Because there was an 1,100-word story in the New Jersey Mirror, one of the longest stories about Black people that I saw there. It uses words like kidnappers and invaders to describe the slave catchers. It's full of humorous anecdotes saying things like, Perry at once suspected who they were and the object of their midnight errand, and very coolly answered they would not fool Perry Simmons with any stories such as that. The story being that they were coming to catch Perry because he had stolen chickens and he knew he had not done that. It says, another funny thing that it says that old Alberti at one time started up the stairway, but as he turned around so that the top was visible, he saw that the muzzle of Perry's musket was but a short distance from his nose, and he came down something quicker than he went up. And then it says, They concluded that discretion was the better part of valor, and they hastily retreated to their carriages and left the scene of their brilliant achievement as if old Satan was after them. So this is actually a funny long story about Black people fighting back against slave catchers and winning the battle. The next week in the paper, it essentially says that the slave catchers tried, so they would have a better chance of capturing Perry. They said he'd stolen chicken, then they got a local constable to come with them to help capture Perry. But then when the constable found out that he hadn't stolen chicken, that they were trying to take him into slavery, he basically had a fight. He had to walk home from West Hampton to Morristown. That was in the paper the next week. That was not only in the local New Jersey paper, it was also in the paper in Trenton and the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Monmouth Democrat. So Timbuctoo is a known place to many people, not just in Burlington County. So here we have a couple of institutions founded in Timbuctoo, and again, I need to move the controls. Peter Quire is the seller. Edward Giles, Hezekiah Hall, and Major Mitchell are identified as trustees in the deed. Hezekiah Hall, again, was my fourth great grandmother's husband. Giles is our family name. I suspect that he's either my uncle or my fifth great grandfather, but I'm not sure. And Major Mitchell was our next door neighbor. But anyway, there were trustees in the deed. It says, whereas in the settlement of Timbuctoo and the vicinity thereof, there are many people of color, so-called, who seem sensible of the advantages of a suitable school education and are destitute for a house for that purpose. And the said Peter Quire and Maria, his wife, in consideration of their premises and the affection they bear to the people of color, and the desire they have to promote their true and best interest, are minded to settle, give, grant, and convey said premises to the uses and intents hereinafter pointed out and described. Well, this was surprising for many reasons. I didn't know we called ourselves people of color in 1834, but I transcribed this from a handwritten 1834 document. I didn't know that we could file a document in the county clerk's office declaring what we're going to do, to the extent of even saying that future trustees had to be people of color who lived within 10 miles of the premises. Very clearly, Black people were on the move. Black people were bold. Black people were declaring themselves free and ready to do what they wanted to do and would fight back against any obstacle. And the evidence of this is a deed in the county clerk's office. I should say that before incorporation of charitable organizations, these included a lot of information that today would be in a corporation certificate, but they didn't have those in 1834. This is the last institution. It is the Zion Wesleyan Methodist Episcopal African Church of Timbuctoo. It says the names of the buyers and the sellers, and it says that the premises would be used as a place of religious worship and a place to bury the dead according to the rules and discipline of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in America. It goes on to say things about the rules and regulations of the AME Zion Church. And it also talks about the fact that it's going to be a cemetery. Today, or recently, until recently, people called this the Timbuctoo Civil War Memorial Cemetery because people thought that it was a cemetery only for US colored troops. When in fact, if we go to the next slide, you can see that this is what we call a geophysical survey. This is the cemetery lot. The reddish colored squares are grave shafts. The ones with crosses are marked graves, or if they have headstones. And so there are many without headstones. The reason for that was that common people often had wooden grave markers that wouldn't survive time. And then the green ones are like a question mark. But the point is, there are 11 crosses and 9 or 8 of them are US colored troops. So people thought that it was the US colored troop cemetery, when in fact is a church cemetery, an AME Zion Church cemetery. And there's lots of history behind the church, but you have to know that it was a church cemetery in order to even look for that. This is what the cemetery looks like today. These are interpretive signs we put in the front of the cemetery. The one on the right tells the story of the US colored troops. There's a bio for each person, and there's a QR code that you can scan your phone on to get more information. To the left, there's another sign that's not visible in this picture that gives the history of the church, and then the sign in the middle is the history of Timbuktu. But this we call the only above ground evidence of Timbuktu's historic past. And so one of the things we would like to do is what is called a visitor readiness survey, because we want to know, and people can certainly send me emails if you have any ideas. If you have this rich history, but all you have to look at is the cemetery, what other things can you do to make it inviting for people to visit? Data sources that I used to find this information. You saw the deeds. Without the deed, I wouldn't know the name John Brewer. There were actually two deeds, 1829 and 1831. They gave me the location of my ancestor, exactly where he lived. His will gave me his name, the name of my third great grandmother and third great grandfather, where they lived. And I could use that information to look. This was done in the early 90s. Today, I can take that information, and did take it to look on ancestry.com to find out more information about my family. The indenture of mortgage provided the name of my third great grandfather, which I didn't know before, introducing a surname associated with our present day family that I did not know before I had these documents. Then the mortgage document was one that we talked about. In addition to the story about the bricks, it told me about the fact that they had to borrow the money, how they paid it back. There was a deed from 1930 that had the exact legal description that was included in the 1829 and 1831 deed. So it makes reference to people that lived in the property 100 years before. This is one that surprises people. We have the New Jersey Births and Christening Index, the New Jersey Deaths and Burials Index, which you can actually, if you know the names of your ancestors, go to these indexes and find the names of ancestors. So I can go, for example, and put in the name Giles in Burlington County, and I get the brothers and sisters of my great-great-grandfather. He was born in 1857, but his oldest sibling was born in 1850, and I get a birth record for him. And I also get their death records as early as 1872. And of course, we are probably all familiar with Ancestry.com and the search engines it has for the US Census. The 1950 census will be available in April. And then the last collection of records is the ones that come from the county offices. As I said, the deed books are online now. We used to only read them by microfilm. They actually go back to 1751 online, which is amazing. We also have corporation records. So the churches and the school are in the, not the school, because the school is a deed, but the churches all have incorporation certificates, which contain information. And then the county surrogate has probate records. Coming to a close, I wanted to show you the things we did to raise the profile of Timbuktu and make people understand its importance. We started out with a road sign in 2017 on Mount Holly Rancocas Road that just tells you where Timbuktu is. Then the interpretive signs in the cemetery were done in 2018. In 2019, we worked with teachers from West Hampton Middle School and Rancocas Valley High School to develop curricula and materials, because you could grow up in Timbuktu and be the third generation that lived there and have no idea of this history of the area where you live. In 2019, we founded the Timbuktu Historical Society to carry on this work. Previously had been done, and is still done, by a committee in West Hampton Township. In 2020, we did research projects. This year, and last year, we've been shooting a documentary. Last year, we acquired title to the Timbuktu Cemetery, and we're working on cemetery preservation. And the one thing that we would like to do this year that has needed to get done for a long time is to have Timbuktu listed on the National and New Jersey Registers of Historic Places. We want to acknowledge the teachers that did the work on the curriculum. That's one way that we can institutionalize this history, because kids learn it in school now and they didn't before, and we're continuing to further expand that work this year as well. And we also acknowledge the Timbuctoo Advisory Committee of West Hampton Township and the the West Hampton Township governing body, because all of this started in in the year 2010, when archaeologists from Temple University expressed interest in doing excavation in Timbuctoo. That was a surprise to many of us, because you think archaeology, you think Pompeii, you think Egypt, you think Mayan ruins, but who thinks that you can dig in New Jersey and learn African-American history? And so the archaeologists would dig and they would find a bottle that said Dixie Peach. What does that mean? If you're Black, you know that Dixie Peach was the hair pomade that Black people used. You would find bricks of a certain quality or dishes of a certain quality, and from the quality of the things that they found, they said, well, this is a cheap brick. These people must not have had money. But this house has expensive bricks. Those people had more financial resources. So they're able to look at, they say one man's trash is another man's treasure. They're able to look at the things that we consider to be useless and really learn interesting things about people. But that was where all of this research got started. And from there, we began doing the historical research. And 12 years later, we're still at it. Conclusions: our history is dominated by the narrative of horrible exploitation and injustice that we must acknowledge. But sometimes we acknowledge it so much that we don't consider that we also have a history of resistance, persistence, resilience, and achievement. We actually do things, we own things, we have achievements we can be proud of. We have documentation that we don't even know is there, because everyone tells us there's no documentation, and we don't look because we assume that it's not there. So how do we balance the notion of acknowledging the narrative of the ugly and acknowledging the narrative of achievement and resistance and persistence and so forth? That is a battle that we constantly have. One of my very good friends, when I told her I was going to do this talk tonight, said, oh, New Jersey was the big slaveholding state. Well, it was, but that's not all that New Jersey was. New Jersey was other things too, and we have an interesting history that we need to tell, along with the ugly history of slavery. Thank you very much. This is the website where you can learn more information about Timbuctoo. That is the email address where you can drop me a line if you have any questions. Thanks.